For this video, I'm going to be talking about some foundational techniques for identifying aspects of any given source reference that you're trying to draw, and how to mark that down in ways that you can remember, and how to transfer that to your drawing. And what I'd like to do for my students initially is to sort of learn about a lot of these principles and techniques with literally the photo of something that we're drawing right next to where we're going to be drawing it. So we sort of start understanding how to relate one part of a drawing, one part of a reference to another part of a reference, and then how to do that in our drawing as well. So it's going to end up something like this. It's not a video on rendering by any means. So I'm just basically doing some blocking in and stuff. So a toucan. So here's an image of a toucan, and it's a little bit transparent, just so it's easier to see the pencil show up. And I think really one of the hardest things about drawing, I know I say this probably a lot, is to establish indeed what is up and down and what is side to side and what's forward and backwards. The forward and backwards part gets even more involved. So I think it's critical to really kind of understand how to translate something into two dimensions. That's sort of stating the obvious, but perhaps not. And this is a great way to just sort of do it, I think, through photographs, especially because if you can't sort of do it, really understand kind of the shape that these things take up and the angles and how to draw them in a way that is consistent with what you've already defined as what is up and down. I'm not sure how I started that sentence, but that's really important. So so I do like to literally crop out images like this. So everything here, even though the video is at an angle, so it's a little weird watching, but everything I have, all the reference I have, is screaming out. This is up. This is down. This is left. That's right. And as you're drawing, especially when you start getting more involved with just drawing things from life, the harder it is to decide on that and to stick to that. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just take my actual framing device here. And when I say frame, the outer dimensions of this photograph, the rectangular outer dimensions. And I'm going to go to the outside. I'm going to just drop down some very sketchy plumb lines, extend some sketched out plumb lines, you might call it. And I'm just going to first transfer this actual rectangle, starting with the biggest ideas first. In this particular case, I'm starting with a rectangle. You could certainly just start with the biggest part of the bird, or all sorts of ways, but this is one way of doing it. So there's a couple different ways to do that. The way that I am encouraging folks to get comfortable with as soon as possible is to understand how the diagonal running, a imaginary diagonal line running from one corner to another corner, defines the proportions, not the overall dimension, but defines the proportions of any rectangle, up and down. Anyways, There's a couple different ways of understanding proportions, and you can sort of understand how many times the short side might go into a long side, and that's a great skill to have. You might learn how to sort of think of the long side and think of that as how it relates to the short side, and the short side in this case, I don't know, being sort of 70%. But what learning how to use angles in all sorts of ways is extremely powerful, and the better we get at it, the sooner the more we can start using it to our advantage. So I'm just extending these lines down. I'm sketching in a diagonal here, and I want to replicate this rectangle. So by using what the easiest things the most obvious. So the most obvious are dropping these down, these lines, because that gives me the width. Not as obvious is the height. And like I said, how I'm figuring that out is by understanding this diagonal. So I'm going to start lightly sketching in a line that somewhat emulates this diagonal. There you have it, a perfect diagonal replication. And no, that's supposed to be funny. I'm going to sneak up on it here. I'm going to hone in. I'm going to start loose, and as I get more and more sure of it, I'm going to tighten up the screws. I make an analogy of making IKEA furniture, of starting off with really having things just finger tight, very loose, so I can adjust. And the more confident you get that you're actually following the instructions, the more you can start tightening up the screws. And so that's a fun little metaphor for me, and hopefully you too. So I can tell a couple things are going on with this diagonal line, besides just being really light and sketchy. I want to make sure that it is straight. And one way to keep checking that is by using my pencil to help me determine if it's straight all the way. So I can tell that it's not exactly straight. It's getting me off to a pretty good start. Especially down here, it starts going awry. So at this point where it meets up here, will represent, if I've done this angle correctly, will represent the bottom of the rectangle. That point there. The other thing I'm doing is using my eyeballs and really looking at particular shapes, in particular this triangle. And does that triangle really seem to read the same to me as this triangle? And I am going to say that it's not quite. It's close, but it feels like this is a little bit taller of a triangle than this is. So I'm checking here, and I want to see, and it still looks a little too short, but I want to not spend too much time on this video doing just this diagonal. But The and I'm also, so now I am going to use another technique that is not as simple to do when you're drawing from life. It's somewhat easier to do if you're just, okay, that's kind of funny. I'm using my pencil literally to see how tall this image is. And it's a good thing I'm doing it now, because it looks like my pencil is almost not big enough. So if I'm looking at this correctly, I'm gonna extend these guys out a little bit too, to help me make sure I'm getting that right. I'm going to come down here and get a sense of where it stops down here. And it looks like I'm decently close. So you can, one important skill to have is definitely to be able to use a pencil to capture sort of distances, relationships on things that you're drawing, and using that to transfer to where you are drawing. Usually I would have, this is a different kind of pencil, but usually I would have a longer pencil, and then I would put the pencil tip at one end and put my thumbnail at the other end. Keep holding that distance, and then check that, it's a little bit more accurate way of doing this kind of thing. Is it that? So I am gonna go back to my short pencil here. So that's great for just sort of setting things up. Now what I want to do is I want to find what I call the top right and the bottom and the left perimeter points of the object that I'm actually drawing. So the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. And I'm going to indicate those with basically just little sketch marks. I might start calling them target marks. I might not, but I'll decide that later. Something else that I'm deciding for this particular drawing is, depending on what you are drawing, there's often just decisions that are helpful to make in how you're conceiving of what it is you're drawing. I'm going to conceive of this bird that I'm drawing as an object that has this big shape and the shape of the body here. I'm not going to include, first of all, these limbs sticking out. You certainly could if you wanted to do that, but I'm going to, more and more I do find that trying to wait on things that sort of stick out of the main drawing that you're working on, I have better luck doing it in that sequence as opposed to the other way. So that's mostly to say I'm going to do the top, which I've already done. I'm going to do the mark down the farthest right point of the bird's body. I'm going to imagine that his body sort of comes around like this. So the furthest to the bottom of my piece of paper point is about there. And then the furthest to the left of the body beak combo would be about there. I'll probably actually end up doing that both for the whole bird and nothing but the whole bird, as well as breaking it down to the beak and the body, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So these marks are useful. Yeah, they are useful, but I would say they're even more than that. They're critical things to understand about what this object that I'm drawing. So after I have determined some of these things, I want to transfer these to my drawing. This being my drawing. So I'm going to once again use a plumb line. Plumb meaning it's a reference of something indicating true up and down. I can elaborate more, but if you're really that curious, look up plumb line. It's just it's a guideline. It's a way of helping me figure out how to take information from one spot and transfer it to a different spot. So that's great for that. I am going to also sketch in a level line. That goes through this top point. The paper is being buckly. Buckley. That was the Weimaraner dog. Grew up next to me as a kid. That's a different story, though. So that's just sketching in the top, the mark that goes along the top of the space that the beak and the bird take up. Let me finish that up. I probably should have done that first just before I started transferring. In fact, I'm sure I should have done this first. So imagine I did this first. And it's okay to oversketch, and indeed it's a good habit to get into, to just sort of carry your lines to a little bit further, sometimes a lot further, because those I'm going to be able to use those. Those are going to help. So let's see, I did that one. Let's sort of finish up that one. And now I'm going to sketch in this bottom. Anyways, that one. So now I've created around the body, the bird's body and beak. That's some nice alliteration in case you're curious. Oh, I have fun doing this. What's called, sometimes I call it a bounding box. That more comes from a graphic design, computer graphics kind of background. In fine art, it's historically or commonly referred to as a notional space. But basically it is this rectangle that I'm wanting to make sure I really sort of understand how this bird and beak fit into. One might not think about it, but if I transfer that into only up and down information and side to side information, it actually inhabits quite a large rectangle. Very different in shape from just sort of thinking about this part and this part. So we're going to use that and transfer that information. As you already saw me do, I transferred a plumb line down in the where I'm drawing to my drawing area, and I'm going to do the same for this one over here. So that helps me get the width of the notional space, lining things up. But the height is another question. So that's when I can use a couple different techniques. I can use and trying to transfer this information to the side-to-side information when I'm trying to do it in a fashion that I'm drawing below. I can't just sort of drop a line and use that as a guide. But what I can do is take note of where this point crosses my outer bounding box of the, and I should clarify, the outer frame. And where this crosses that outer frame. And there's a couple ways I can do this. I can, if I'm doing this in the same proportion that which is what I'm doing, I can use my pencil again. This is called, this proportion is when you're doing it the exact same dimensions. It's called 1-to-1. So basically 1 inch, whatever 1 inch might be, 1 inch in what I'm drawing is 1 inch to where 1 inch in my reference is the same as 1 inch to where I'm drawing. 2 inches is the same as 2 inches, etc., etc. Everything relates exactly to each other, equates. Obviously, it's not the only way I'm going to draw eventually. So that is one way I can sort of just transfer information, but that's only going to be true if I'm doing this kind of 1-to-1. So while that's a helpful skill to understand, I do want to show you sort of alternative ways if you're not drawing 1-to-1. One way is to also just imagine sort of how these marks would fit into this whole line if I started breaking this line up into half, and then half again, and then halves and quarters. So that's more of a sort of proportion. What do I want to say? Percentage, fraction. It's proportion, but too many math words. I just jotted down what I think is the middle, bisecting this side in half. And by doing that, then I can tell that this, then I could transfer that information pretty quickly. And then I can say that this line, this mark, is a little bit lower than halfway. So it's just kind of helping me estimate. That technique will start working good when you're trying to draw things bigger or smaller, because that proportion will stay the same regardless of whether I'm drawing it bigger or not. Things will get a little bit different. The other piece that other way of really helping with this kind of thing is by just quickly imagining the diagonal again, which will help me identify how high or how low these marks are going to go. in the same way that this original diagonal told me of the proportions of that original frame, this diagonal tells me the proportions of this little mini rectangle. I'm going to use a couple more pieces of information. I'm seeing that those things are sort of coming together in the right spot down here. Perhaps you need to be a little bit lower. So this is all good stuff, and the kind of stuff that I'm sure will take tweaking and tightening up as I keep going. But I'm going to move forward. I can also figure out what the diagonal of that little rectangle is to help me double check the height to make sure this line is approximately where it should be. So sometimes I like to use the diagonal to literally sort of start figuring out what proportions my marks are in the right spot. Sometimes I like to use it just to check. I'm going to create, just real briefly, just to make sure that I am thinking of this the bounding box for the bird and the beak. It's getting all sort of messy and messed up. So that's, you definitely at some point need to make a decision if all these lines are guide marks are helping or turning into a big annoying mess. And yes, this is getting very close to the big annoying mess part. I am going to start breaking down this bird beak shape into the bird and the beak. And I'm going to do a similar sort of thing. I am going to look at, I started with the frame and did the dimensions of that, and then I started with basically the bird and did the dimensions and proportions of that. And now I'm going to keep zeroing in on the next biggest part. So I'm going to say that the next biggest part is this fun little sort of the shape of his body. I don't know, it's a him or a her. But in the same way that I made indications of where I think the top, the right, and the bottom, and the left of the combination was, I'm going to make indications of where I imagine the top, the right is the same as the larger one, the bottom is the same as the larger one, but the furthest left point for the bird minus the beak is going to be that. So that's going to be helpful, and then I'm going to be able to just drop a plumb line and get a really good idea of where that point is, where the beak overlaps the body of the bird. And I'm going to do the same with the just the beak here. So let's see, the top of the beak is there. Furthest right is about there. Furthest bottom is tricky because you might sort of think, oh, this is the bottom of his beak, but we're talking in terms of 2 dimensions. So when I say the bottom, I mean the point that's closest to the bottom edge. And this left point is the same as the overall. So I'm also going to sketch in a box for that. That's the body. So you're probably saying that, man, when is the part where we actually get to have some fun drawing instead of making a bunch of lines? I'm with you. I'm with you. Trust me. But I will say, it seems like the got to spend your time doing this kind of thing, building your eye skills, hand-eye skills, your sense of proportion, and how things relate to each other. There's other ways to approach this, which I talk about in other videos, but I have found this to be a very helpful way of, when I want to draw something accurately, sometimes I just want to have fun and go crazy, but if I'm trying to create something representational, that going through these steps, while seemingly cumbersome, well, they are cumbersome, but they're worth it. Drop that one down too. Let's see. That's good enough for that right now. Once again, my vertical lines translate quite conveniently, but my horizontal lines not so much if I'm doing this sort of technique. So once again, I can employ that technique of extending these guys out to the side point, and then figuring out how this point relates to the edge. That it's a little bit more than half. Can also just sort of figure out this point right here. By imagining that rectangle that is defined as every other rectangle is, I should say straight up and down rectangle, by its diagonal. So that's making me feel pretty good. That seems like that line is about right. So let's see, I have the beak. The beak bounding box. I have the body bounding box. And I have the whole bird minus the feet and branch. I kind of think of this as like if I was painting the inside of a house. Like there's so much prep. And yeah, you don't have to do this. And you can dive right in, launch right in. But oftentimes it seems like you got to come back to this anyways. So I just sort of feel more confident knowing where things are going to go. I like feeling that. So perhaps you do too. Perhaps not. Either way, I have the beak, I have the body, and I have the whole bird. And I know where that's going to fit down here. I'm going to close off for now and come back in another video.